Hi there. So today I'm going to be talking about several facets of multiculturalism and diversity. And first, I want to start by defining what diversity means. And I think I've sort of come to the conclusion with two sort of main viewpoints of diversity, sort of how people usually conceptualize them, how people usually talk about them. And I think the first version is sort of more the textbook version of diversity. So if you ask someone on the street, what does diversity mean to you? They might answer something along the lines of, well, we are all different people. There's a lot of variation in people and our species as humans. And, we come from different religions, or we come from different, locations around the world. We have different sort of access to resources, and we have different skin colors, and we have different sexual orientations, etc. So we have all these different identity factors about us that people have sort of conceptualized, categorized, and labeled, and that's how we understand people as different or other, or like us. Air quotes there. So I think the second way of really understanding diversity is through a more social political aspect of sort of how people have taken what it means to be the other or the same, and used that in a sort of either abusive or classification way to either, or rather to benefit a certain group. So you have like one or two or three. So it's sort of, there's a different classification of groups, and they have sort of a ranking, and that's been used throughout history as a way to subjugate people. And I've really come to think, there's a couple of really big ways that we can really look at this. And I'm going to get into those mostly throughout this talk. So I think the first really big reason is you have to look at history. We have to understand like what's gone throughout history, world history, starting with antiquity up until the Middle Ages, industrial age, colonialism of the West, up until now. So like, what are some examples? Like, what's been going on? And then the next thing is, even before that, which carries through now, evolutionary psychology, evolutionary biology. Sort of how do human beings operate in groups and networks. So I'm going to get into this further, but sort of the way that anthropologists and evolutionary biologists look at people is sort of tribal units, smaller groups, is really not that different between how sociologists and social workers will interact big groups of people in more complex social situations, rather. So if we get back to sort of the oppressive attitudes that groups of people have had over other groups of people, I'm going to get into some more historical examples in a moment. Like I said, that's one of my main tenets that I think is really important to look at. But in a sense, some of them almost like make sense to us. We can sort of conceptualize it in some ways, but then in other ways it doesn't make sense. Like maybe it makes sense in a sense that it made sense to them. We can see, oh, that's what they were thinking. So if we look at sort of World War One, the aftermath rather of World War One, we had this horrible state in Germany. I mean, it was like economic disparity collapsed. Everyone was in poverty and hungry. Their money meant nothing. There was no bread. It cost a fortune, and so there was this giant fear, and there was desperation, and so this ruler came to power, and he said, mind you, this is before we sort of have internet and libraries in a sort of sense. So there was this leader that came to rule, and there was this party, the Nazi party, that said, we can blame something for your problems, and that's the Jewish people, and then it would be extended to anyone that's not the Aryan race, anyone that's not like you. They're contaminating our world. And I'm going to get into propaganda after I start talking more about history in a minute, because I think that's really big. So that, in a sense, sort of makes sense to us. We can see, okay, so these people were economically disadvantaged, and then they get caught up in this thinking. That this person is less than them, and it's sort of because of an economic destitution and power. If we look at slavery too, I always think with all of these examples, it's like, how does the just like inherent empathy that we want people to have, we think people have this inherent empathy. sort of how does that not just overtake all these examples? But no, people had slaves and they looked at them as subhuman, and they were able to do that because it was an economic source of life for them. I mean, that was how people were able to capitalize on their goods and on their lives, and how they were able to make a well-being for themselves. They looked at another group as less than, and they profited from that work. So I want to start with the evolutionary psychology because I think it's really important to understand sort of the roots of who we are, the nature of us, the nature aspect of psychology. And there are three really big concepts I'm going to get into. So the first two are interrelated, and they are in-group favoritism and out-group degradation, rather. So those are related to how we associate people like us as members of our clan, as people that are like us. So if we look way back when people were living in, I mean, even today in smaller areas like above non-Sub-Sahara, northern desert aspect of Africa, rather, you have some clans, Aboriginals too in northern Australia. There's pre big giant societies, even agricultural societies. People were like in clans, and they related to themselves. And you even see this in apes too. Sort of how if one colony of bonobos or chimpanzees encounters another one, they'll try to kill each other. They assume that people that are like them are the people to protect and trust and to love, and the people that are not like them are the people to kill. And this is like what we observed in a lot of nomadic tribes, is when people would encounter each other, they would often fight because they're fighting for resources, and they're fighting for the people that are like them and that they have experienced empathy and love and all of the aspects of life together with. And so then the next aspect that's going to really segue well into the more history aspect is this concept of out-group homogeneity. And so what that sort of means is how if we have one group of people, say Anglo-Saxons, Anglo-Saxons will understand themselves as sort of the a group of people that has a complex narrative, and they have intricacies within themselves, and they're not one group of people. But then they will look at a group of people like, well, the Spaniards and Portuguese, when they first come to the Americas, they look at sort of the indigenous people of the Pacific and the East Coast of the United States, these tribes of people, as they look at them as sort of these like passive savages that they can easily colonize, and they then associate them as one group of people with, so, this is kind of where stereotypes come in, with certain traits of them that they are this. You can sum it up in 3 phrases, 5 phrases, 5 words, whatever. You can sort of look at them in a few different ways. But if you understand your own group as complex, and you're not just one thing, and you are exactly complex. So then, if we get into sort of the history side of it, I think this is really interesting, because this is something I noticed. I love history. Like, my favorite subject has always been ancient, like, antiquity. So I love the Romans, the Byzantine Empire, the ancient Egyptians, because they were just these huge, complex societies that went on for hundreds of years that were able to flourish. But it's so interesting if you really look at the backbone of all of those societies, and most of them, I mean, for instance, the Romans had a backbone of around 25%, it's estimated, of slaves. Now, slaves were sort of looked at really differently than how we would think of maybe as like 1800s. Slaves in the 17 and 1800s in the United States, they didn't have any legal rights, but they had a sort of social standing, and they were treated, in some instances, sort of like family members, but it wasn't still this glamorous. Like, I'm not trying to portray it as this good lifestyle. But the point is throughout history, we've had sort of conflict. And the way actually the Romans did it was they would take anyone that was sort of a prisoner of war or an orphan, and they would enter a slavehood. They were considered non-Roman. They were considered sort of the epitome of who you should be, this Roman virtuous person. So then, if you look through several different examples throughout history, you really start to see where the role of propaganda comes in. Because what propaganda does is it acts on 2 really key things, which I had already mentioned with World War II. So you had fear and you have desperation. So if you can really act on those things, you can use sort of techniques to otherize a group of people. So in the United States, rather, with the Japanese after World War II and the bombing of Pearl Harbor, there was this sentiment in the United States. It's shown in sort of writings and posters, and it was people are still alive to talk about it. That there was a sentiment of hatred towards the Japanese, and there's these posters that came out, and they're like horrifying to look at. So there's this one that's the famous one where there's this Japanese man who's portrayed as sort of this malicious animal, and his eyes are incredibly exaggerated, and he's trying to, and he has the flag of Japan, I think, on his hat, and he's trying to kill. I think he has a sword with him. He's trying to kill this like gorgeous like American white woman, and that is sort of this whole propaganda in order to make people hate this one group of people. So you then have sort of, again, how the Jews were represented during the Nazi time, and that was that they were the corrupting parasite of the West, and they were trying to steal your money, and this is where these stereotypes that we still hear today, we all get the same information. This is where these stereotypes come from, and they were put in posters and newspapers and columns having huge noses, and eventually it led to you were labeled. You had a star, you were the Juden, and depending on who you were, if you were disabled or homosexual, or you wore a certain type of star to label who you were. And then people have this sort of association, again, that outgroup homogeneity, that you are a certain way. And the last one I want to talk about is how in Rwanda, how the Hutsus and Tutsis were portrayed. And it's so interesting because this was taking place over sort of a couple of generations. So you actually had all these Hutsus and Tutsis that were intermarried together, and they had families together, and they loved each other, and they were sort of part of a society together. But again, when there was sort of an economic problem in the country, there was like less morale. They tried to hold on to this last idea that the Tutsi were not they were the problem. They were the parasite to the Rwandan success and the Rwandan morale. And so they sort of portraying Tutsi as this. And again, the newspapers and columns, and people catch on, and they jump onto this. And sort of the psychology and the history both show us is that people have this tendency to absolutely decrease their empathy for people that they don't associate as them. And what this is known as is pseudo-speciation. So pseudo-speciation refers to how people will take a group of people that they associate as not like them, and then they will consider them to be not human and less than human. And you don't have to think of them as human. And if they don't have to think of them as human, it's easier to do horrible things to them. And so this is, to me, so important to talk about, because I see this all the time. I mean, I think this is in every modern context. I mean, this is happening right now in Rohingya, with the Muslims there. This happens in the United States with how people homogenize a group of, almost 2 billion Muslims. I mean, Muslims are a hugely diverse group of people. But also it happens right here in terms of how the left views the right and the right views the left. It's sort of this all or nothing. You either, if you're part of the left or if you're part of the right, depending on which side you are on, you sort of have this idea that my group is this intricate, complex, devoted, we have this sort of inherent intelligence that they don't have, and this other group of people is XYZ, but they're all bad. They're all bad, and that's all they are. They're not anything else. They're not complex beings with maybe complex opinions and nuances and experiences. So both sides have this really polarized view, and they kind of hate each other in a lot of senses. And I think that the most important takeaway from this, well, there's two of them. The first one is that morality does not fall onto one group of people. Morality is something that's within every single person, and how they've, gone through their life cycle to understand sort of the world. I mean, I think of people as, for the most part, minus sort of the occasional psychopath, as wanting the same thing. They want the best for themselves and their families and for their communities. I mean, if you ask people around the world, what do you want out of life, they'll probably give you a variation of that answer. They want the best for their community, and they want it in probably a different way than you want it, but that's kind of the basic answer. The next thing is that I don't think of diversity as an us and a them. And what I mean by that is I think that in order to understand everything I just talked about, you have to understand that we're all capable of, in a sense, what happened. Because, what has happened throughout history? What has happened to the Hutsus and the Tutsis? What happened with the gulags in Soviet Russia? And what happened with the Nazis killing the Jews? These people were typically peasants, or they were middle class people that were taken advantage of through their fear and desperation, and then they hated another group. And it's it's really sad and it's really scary, but I think that that's the point of this, is that we can all fall prey to something like this. And if we recognize that our biases are a part of us and that we kind of naturally have this sort of inclination, we can probably, you know, do better to live in a multicultural society, because in a lot of ways, diversity actually brings amazing things. I mean, it brings a diversity of ideas, and it brings a diversity of, lifestyles and different understandings of resources and how we do different things, and that's beautiful. And I think that that's something that should be celebrated. But in order to really look at, like, how do we create this diversity, it's not that this group of people doesn't want it and that this group of people does want it. It's that we're all falling prey to sort of this scapegoating and biasing, and I think that yeah, we should all just look to our biases. So thank you so much for listening. I know this went a little bit over 10 minutes, but I hope you enjoyed. Have a good one.